This is November 18th, 2019. It's a beautiful day out here, outside here in Louisville, and the sun is shining and it's crisp and cool. I've got all my leaves raked up, but I still have to get rid of them yet, so I still have some work out there, but it's good to get out in the crisp, fresh air of fall. The climate here is one of the reasons why Shirley and I decided to stay here when I quit working in 1991. We didn't have a house. Our stuff was all in storage. And I'd been working at various places as a consulting engineer, and we didn't need furniture of our own because we always rented a furnished place, and as part of the project costs of the clients, so that we had very few expenses, and we had no furniture that we needed. So when I decided to quit working, we wanted to build a house and establish permanent roots somewhere. And we had traveled all over the world and every state in the Union, and we had lived here originally when I was with GE. We moved here in 1957. It was an ideal climate as far as we were concerned. Had 4 clearly defined seasons, and yet none of the seasons were radically cold or hot. If it's a little too cold or a little too hot, stick around a day or so and we'll get relief. It's really a green climate here, lots of rain, lots of sunshine, very little snow or bad weather. We have a tornado or two periodically, and we just liked it here and never regretted living here. It's a pleasant city, the people are friendly, and it just suited us to a T. I want to talk about Mom and Dad and their background and relationships in the beginning of this video. Mom and Dad didn't get along really well. Their relationship seemed to be one of confrontation and numerous disagreements about the most trivial things. And I think a lot of factors were involved here, and I think maybe probably the one thing that really was overwhelming to both of them was the economic situation and Dad's inability to get work within 2 years of their marriage. He was laid off in 1930 because of the crash, and they were forced to move to Frenchville, and that put a tremendous stress on their marriage right from the beginning. Before they had a chance to really become settled in and get that first 5 years of marriage under their belt. They came from different backgrounds, and yet they were very similar in the way that raised. Mom was raised in Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania, in a town where there were neighbors. They had electricity, but they didn't have indoor plumbing, but that was a common thing back in the years of the 20th century, and of course in the millenniums before that. My mom went to high school, and she worked as a secretary at the Prudential Insurance Office in Phillipsburg. So she lived I hate to even say city life, but Phillipsburg was a town of about 15,000, and they had streets and street lights and stores, and it was a little town. It's very depressed today, but it was a booming place in those days. Whereas Dad was born and raised on this farm in Frenchville, never went beyond the 3rd grade, and was number 10 of a family of 13. And they lived on this farm that, well, actually there were 3 farms in total, but it was all hard labor and agricultural type work during the summer, and then in the winter it was work in the woods. Of course, Dad trained and got a job as a telegraph operator on the New York Central. And so when they got married, he had 20 years roughly of service on the railroad, and he had served in the Army and educated himself and had a beautiful penmanship skill. And so he was not an uneducated redneck, but their whole lifestyles were so vastly different before their marriage that it was certainly an issue. Mom graduated from high school in Phillipsburg, and from the looks of her report card that I saw some years ago, her grades were certainly better than average. And then after high school, she got a job as a secretary at an office of the Prudential Insurance Company there, and used shorthand to record the directions and letters and so forth from our boss, and performed other secretarial duties, and served as a secretary until she was married. I have a couple of her flapper dresses from the 20s, and obviously they're party dresses, and cut to that particular style, and it's easily recognizable what era it came from. The flapper dresses of that time were distinct, and hers are definitely of that era. So I suspect that she had dates and went to dances and so forth like any other young woman. And but I don't know. I don't know a thing about her early life. I never thought to ask her, and she never volunteered, and she was dead and gone before I even had an idea of doing genealogy and history of their backgrounds. So, although I do remember one little snippet that she mentioned one time, somehow we were talking about hair, and she told me that when she was a young teenager, her mother made her wear long pigtails. She really hated those things. So one day, on the way from school, she stopped at the barber shop, and the barber just whacked them off without undoing them first. And I guess the butchery that resulted caused Mom a lot of grief when she got home. Mom said that her mother was really mad at her. She never talked about her high school friends or anything like that, but I do remember one time, and I think Dad was in the CC camps then, the mailman delivered a letter from an old friend of hers by the name of Gail Carmichael. And this Gail lived in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which is along the southern border of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And she was, I remember, very touched and emotional about receiving a letter from someone. And I know that she responded immediately, but I don't think that the correspondent progressed from there for some reason. I do remember Mom saying that this friend was sick, and so maybe she died. As far as I can remember, that's the only letter that Mom ever received, at least while I was at home. After their marriage, they set up housekeeping in a rented house in Winburn, mining town about 10 miles from the farm. They went there because Dad was the telegraph operator at the railroad station there. They lived in a rented house located on the side of a hill. But after they moved away from there, the house burned down along with the church, and my baptismal certificate was burnt in the church at the same time. But Dad had a new Oakland, which is a precursor for the Pontiac, and I think the model year was in 1926. It was a big old thing. I remember it, and it was not a good car. Dad didn't keep it very many years. In fact, I think he traded it 2 years later. Yes, he traded it after they went to Frenchville, to the farm, because there's a photograph of the Oakland in the garage, and the old 28 Chevy also parked in front of the garage. So that transition happened then. The Oakland really must have been a bad car for Dad to get rid of it that soon. I think probably the best years of their married life was the 2.5 years of residence in Winburn. Because Winburn wasn't a city by any means, but it was a consolidated area where people lived in lots next to each other, and there were stores and so forth, and electricity. A vastly different world than one that they moved to at Frenchville and a farm. So they moved there. I'm sure Mom did so with great reluctance. The house that was there was the one that Dad had built as a replacement for the one that burned down in 1922. And it was just a frame shell, only suitable really for one person to live there because Dad didn't finish the inside except in the kitchen and one of the bedrooms. And it was a plank construction, which was typical in those days before balloon construction became popular and is what's used today. In those days, planks were nailed vertically around a framework of timbers, and then a horizontal layer of planks was nailed to the outside of that. Then that was covered with another layer of cove board or other milled boards of an equal size and with a configuration in them to make it more pleasing to the eye. So that's the way the house there was constructed. And of course it had no facilities inside, no water or electricity or telephone. You had to travel over the hills and through the woods for approximately a mile before you came to the nearest house. So it was really isolated. Although the fields were cleared around the house, the woods were really dense beyond that. The lack of amenities, indoor plumbing was not a major issue since Mom was accustomed to an outdoor toilet, but the fact that there wasn't any electricity or telephone or neighbors within close to a mile. But the fact that they had to move to this isolated farm on a dirt road where there was very little traffic, and certainly she had no friends there. And although she had taken French in high school and was familiar with it, the language around the area there, all the neighbors and everyone in the near vicinity spoke almost exclusively French, although English was spoken commonly also. So everybody was a French-oriented descendant from an immigrant from France. Her parents were German and Irish and had immigrated through Virginia and into Pennsylvania at a much earlier time than great-grandpa. The best research I can find is that they came in the 1780s or so. Data is difficult to isolate. They were Methodists, but their attendance at the Methodist Church in Phillipsburg, I don't think it was very frequent, and I don't believe my mother was very active in the church before she married Dad. She did convert to the Catholic Church as a result of her marriage. There was a lot of prejudice between the religions, especially with Catholics and Protestant sects such as the Methodists. So while her conversion helped mitigate that issue, it was still an underlying factor in her acceptance in the neighborhood. A lot of this might sound like criticism, but if you place yourself in the persona of the people that lived around there, first of all, they didn't know any better. They were the first generation from the immigrants, for the most part, although some of them were. Few old ones were still alive, but basically the people that were there were the firstborn in the United States. But Frenchville was a very isolated place, and they only knew what their parents had taught them and the language that they spoke. But they were forced to learn English in 1912 when the state passed a law that the schools had to teach in English. So English was a common second language, but it wasn't the preferred one in that generation. These people inherited the suspicion and the fear of the future and the experiences that were so negative for so many thousands of years in France that were common and normal to those people. Old habits die hard, and that mindset and habits of being very tight with their money and very, very conservative, very close knit within the family. And the families didn't know each other's financial status, that's for sure. That was a military secret of the highest order. So it was just not an open society, and it was a gossipy society too. And everybody seemed to know everybody else's business, and there was endless conversation about nothing really. It was something to talk about, and with the absolute absence of electricity and radios and telephones, there wasn't a lot else to talk about. The weather gets pretty old in a hurry, and it was always kind of crummy around there anyway. So it was unique. My mother, as I mentioned earlier, was a secretary and worked in an office up until the time she got married when she was 27. So that was an additional issue that faced her when they came there at Frenchville. And she certainly didn't get any help from the neighbors. I only recall one time when a neighbor woman came for a little while to visit her in all the years that I was there. But in any case, Mom was stranded there with her apprehensions and 2 little children and without friends, parents too far away to communicate frequently, and they didn't live long after Mom moved to Frenchville. So there was no rapport with them. She came there totally isolated in every sense of the word, and I don't know how she coped with it. She was a strong woman, although she didn't act, and her personality wasn't that one of domineering or one of being in authority and demanding her way. Actually, she was pretty mild and soft, and left me do what I wanted to do with very little supervision. And since she was the one that I was with most of the time, I did what I wanted to do. And not that it was bad or evil, but still, I was free to do what I wanted to do and entertain myself the way I wanted to do. I'm trying to imagine how my mother must have felt when she was forced to accompany Dad and her 2 children to this really dump place. But my dad didn't have a job, and there was no choice really. What else was he going to do? And I'm sure that he felt equally as terrible about the whole thing as my mother did. Maybe even worse, because he had the responsibility now of trying to find a job and support his family at 42 years of age. And he wasn't an old-time hand at being married, so this was all new to him too, and had to be depressing. There was no chance of finding a job in that area. Skills that he learned at the telegraph office, which were not in any demand whatsoever. State of mind must have been very grim and blue too. And of course they were newly married, which brings its own problems even in good times. A lot of marriages don't survive the first 5 years. And so they had a mountain to climb to get out of that hole. And my mother did her share, that's for sure. She learned how to cook and can and bake and do the washing all by hand, and garden, and well, whatever was required to fill the hole, she stepped up and did it. And I never heard her really complain about her lifestyle. I know she wasn't happy, but she didn't mope and refuse to cook or refuse to do anything that needed to be done. But on the contrary, she stepped up, and I'm sure she contributed over half of her responsibilities. But I remember one day, and I don't know where my dad was. I think they had a big fight. I don't remember that. I don't remember hearing about a fight or anything, but I suspect they did. And perhaps Dad took a walk into the woods or something. I don't know. But I know my mother was there with my sister and I would say possibly I was 4 years old, something like that. Very young, I remember. And I saw Mom in the bedroom there, their bedroom on the first floor there, and she was packing clothes in a suitcase that she had lying on the bed. And Ruth was with me, my sister. She was a year younger. So we were asking Mom what she was doing, and she said she was running away, couldn't stand it anymore. And gosh, that was we didn't want her to go, and it was cold too. But she kept packing her suitcase, and when it was full, she closed it up, went out the front door. It had a window in it, but it was too high for us to see out, so we ran over to the front room windows and watched her go up the sidewalk to the road and start walking down the road. And of course, it was a dirt road and pretty rough. She had to step over the ruts and so forth. And she walked to the bottom of the hill. I would say probably 1,000 feet, perhaps. In any case, when she reached the bottom of the hill, she just stopped and stood there for some time. Then she turned around and came home. Of course, after calming down, she realized she couldn't walk away from us and leave us alone there. And how was she going to ever get to Phillipsburg, 20 miles away over these back roads? So she gave up. I never talked to Ruth about it, so I don't know how she felt or what her memories were. Mom hung in there and assumed her duties as a mother and protector of Ruth and I, and fulfilled her obligations in every way that she could possibly do. She cooked our meals and provided us with sufficient food based on what she had there. Generally, it was fried potatoes and eggs and the vegetables from the garden that she had canned, and of course we always had milk and butter during the times that the cow was not being prepared for calving. She stored eggs in a material called water glass, and I'm not sure what that chemical was, but it sealed the shells from osmosis and preserved the eggs, although they didn't taste as good, and I didn't care much for them. But nevertheless, she made soup, vegetable soup, and rice and pork soup, and other nutritious things. We never went hungry, that's for sure, and we had 3 meals a day, every day, of one thing or another. A lot of oatmeal for breakfast and that type of thing. The other big weekly chore, which came with the fate of sunrise and sunset, was the baking of bread. Mom baked quite a few loaves of bread. I have no recollection of how many, but I know that the pile of dough that she made in preparation for baking was large, and she worked on that dough for quite a few hours, kneading it and then putting it in the pans and letting it rise, and kneading it again and letting it rise again, and covering it over with cloths for some reason. I'm not sure why, but while it was rising. But she'd roll it back and forth on the table, and it was just a lot of work. And of course she used yeast and lard with the flour. So the bread really turned out well. It was great stuff. And it took a while to bake, and of course the stove had to be fired up in order to heat the oven. And it had to be a certain temperature before she would put the dough in the oven, but the crust always came out nice and crisp and brown. And it was great to cut off the heel of the loaf while it was hot and just slather a half a pound of homemade butter on the crust there and eat it. It still makes my mouth water, but it was a day's chore to do that. One of the chores that came up on the horizon with regularity that I never cared for, because I was the one that got stuck with the monotonous process of churning the cream that Mom had accumulated. The process involved taking the fresh milk and pouring it into a crock, large 5-gallon or maybe 8-gallon crock, ceramic crock, and letting it sit and permitting the cream to rise to the surface. And as the milk cooled and the cream rose to it's as much as was going to rise, Mom would skim that cream off and put it into a smaller crock. And each day then, when we got a new batch of milk, this process was repeated until she accumulated a gallon or two of really heavy cream. And when that happened, of course, my massive muscular frame was called into being to rotate the churn. This churn was a barrel-shaped wooden thing with paddles on the inside of it and a crank on the outside. And of course, Mom would pour the cream inside of that thing, and that's when I heroically took over and turned that crank handle for the next half hour, 40 minutes, or eternity, it seemed to me. And sometimes it would churn in a reasonable amount of time, but other times it seemed that it didn't want to turn. I didn't want to churn, and by churning I mean the crank had to be turned until the thin, pale whitish water separated from the cream. So I knew the churning was completed when the globules of cream floated around in the watery solution inside the churn. Mom would pour the churn contents through a cloth and separate the watery substance from the cream and butter globules, and then she would knead all those globules together into a large lump, and she'd keep kneading that until the watery substance was all squeezed out of it. And it took quite a bit of kneading to do that, so it took a lot of strength for her to do that. But then she'd add some salt and roll it up into a large lump, and of course that was our butter. And we didn't have a refrigerator, so she kept it in the cellar where it was cooler. One of the banes of Mom's life was keeping the floor clean. The place around there was unpaved, except for a narrow strip of concrete from the front steps out to the road, which did absolutely nothing to help her, because the mud in the miles around there were just impossible. It was impossible to avoid. So one of the things that we did, of course, was seldom go in the front door. We always went around to the back porch and stomp our feet and so forth. But the mud and dirt got tracked in endlessly. And the floor in the kitchen was covered with linoleum, which was a slick, hard surface. So sweeping it wasn't too difficult, but of course you could never get all the dried mud up by sweeping. And so Mom had to mop that thing periodically, like a couple times a week. And of course, that inadvertently got tracked into the living room and other places. And the living room also had linoleum, so that had to be endlessly mopped and swept too. And of course, carrying coal into the house to fire the kitchen stove during the summer, and both the kitchen stove and the living room stove when that was lit. And of course, coal is dirty. That's just the only thing you can use to describe it. And it had its own generation of dirt. Then, of course, the firewood that had to be carried in, and there was a box in the kitchen where I would put the firewood in preparation for her use. And of course, it had chips and so forth on it, and it did its part in keeping the house dirty. So Mom was inescapably anchored to that project. And then in the summertime, of course, there were the flies, and keeping the screen door closed as much as possible and keeping holes out of the screen. There were always accidents, or some kid, one of us would kick the screen and tear it, and then it had to be patched, sometimes with yarn or something, to keep the flies out of it, because they'd find the hole and come into the house. Food cooking and so forth attracted them endlessly. And of course the barn and the cattle and the pigs and so forth were just powerful magnets for every fly in the world, and the barn was always always had flies, and that's a bane of dairy farming. Flies are constantly present, and they're difficult to control. So there were always flies in the kitchen, and no matter how many times Mom swatted them and how many sticky tapes she hung up, it seemed that there was always some flies somewhere. And she battled furiously against those enemies. But her trials were, there was always something to give her something to do and fight against. She really had a tough life there. And of course, during the canning season, which started sometime in the summer when the first vegetables came ripe, and I don't know what the season was. It was in the summer and fall, I know. The blueberries that we picked, and just the carrots and beets and beans and so forth. She canned endlessly, and of course they all had to be carried down into the basement or in the cellar where there were shelves down there where she kept her canned goods. And she always used mason jars with in the early days there were zinc lids with a glass liner, but then as the years wore on, probably the war stopped the use of zinc for those lids, and somebody came up with the bright idea of using a two-piece lid, and it's the same thing that's used today, 100 years later, or close to it anyway. But canning was a lot of work. She had to fire up that stove, which of course made the kitchen a furnace, and boil the water, and of course she had to scald the jars and disinfect them before she put any food in there. And then after the food was in, she had to put them back in the boiler and cook them so that the interior was hot. And then when she thought that the food was either cooked or hot enough, she'd quickly clamp on the lid, and the cooling of the vegetables inside would create a vacuum and preserve them. It was a very simple system in technical terms, but it was a lot of work when she had to keep the fire going and carry the water over to the stove and fill up that big boiler, that canner she called it. And of course it took, I don't know how long it took for those jars to boil and get hot enough for her to prepare to put the lids on, but it was a difficult whole number of hot days doing that. And of course we didn't have any air conditioning or fans, or electricity to run a fan, so it was primitive. And she made her own soap too. Not always, but quite often, and she'd use ashes from a bonfire that we'd set to burn something, wood, I guess. I don't really remember why or what we used to make bonfires, but the ashes then were used in the soap, along with lye and some lard or grease of some sort. Lard, it had to be lard because that's all the grease that she had. So those three components cooked together made a really potent laundry soap. One of the luxuries that Grandma Rougie had was a building separate from the house, below the house there, called the summer kitchen. And of course, Grandma Rougie had 13 kids to cook for, plus probably some hired hands once in a while. But in any case, every day for certain, she had a whole bunch of kids and her husband to feed. And during the summer, the kitchen stove would never have gone out. So they built this, I'd say 600 or 800 square foot building adjacent to the house there, and had a stove and the kitchen utensils and the cooking apparatuses there. So during the summer, they didn't have to make the house a boiling furnace with the kitchen stove going full blast all day long. And it provided a measure of comfort at night and during the summer when the whole house became intolerably hot and no way to cool it. Well, I think that's about all for now. Go to the next one.